With the NBA trade deadline approaching next week, one of the biggest question marks among Bulls fans, as well as the Bulls front office really, is what do the Bulls do with Nikola Vucevic, their starting center, arguably their third best player, a player they gave up a lot to acquire in the form of 2 first-round picks and Wendell Carter Jr. And while Vucevic certainly has underwhelmed Bulls fans compared to the All-Star we thought we traded for from the Magic when he was putting up over 25 and 12, there is something to be said about Vucevic's overall production, his actual improved play from this season, and also just the precarious position the Bulls have found themselves in with Vucevic set to become an unrestricted free agent this offseason. The last thing you want to do is to have a guy you traded 2 first-round picks for and a young player to walk for nothing in free agency. Either you re-sign him to an extension or you cut your losses and move him in a trade in these next few days before the deadline. So in this video, we'll be talking about both of these scenarios and what the Bulls should do with Vucevic going forward. So what's going on, everyone? You're listening to Bulls Central here. Hope you're all doing well. Now, it was nearly 2 years ago that the Bulls' new front office of Arturas Karnisovas and Mark Eversley, their first season at the helm, decided to make a big trade that would change the direction and timeline for the Bulls from being a rebuilding team to a team looking to win now. And that's when they made the trade for Nikola Vucevic, acquiring the big man all-star from the Orlando Magic, a team that was hitting the reset button and triggering their own rebuild. And this was among other trades as well. The Bulls also made moves for Daniel Tice, Troy Brown Jr., Javonte Green, but the moves were headlined around getting that big man in Nikola Vucevic, a big man that was absolutely needed at the time considering the Bulls were one of the worst rebounding teams in the NBA, and they weren't getting the level of offensive production from guys like Wendell Carter Jr. and Lauri Markkanen. Well, fast forward to where we are today, and obviously the entire Bulls roster has been revamped with only the players remaining from the Garpax era being Zach Lavine and Coby White, and despite the Bulls making moves to land DeMar DeRozan and Lonzo Ball to round out the roster, the Bulls have struggled majorly this season, currently sitting 10th in the Eastern Conference below 500. Now, there are a few things to note about Vucevic because while the narrative is Vuce is bad, it was a joke of a trade, the Bulls got fleeced, Vuce is on the decline, we should look to move him ASAP, while he still has some value. Despite all of these ridiculous notions, Vucevic is actually having one of the more productive seasons on this Bulls team and one of the more efficient players on this roster. Yes, Vuce has been inconsistent. Yes, his shooting has been off at times, and yes, his lack of energy and effort at times makes you want to pull your hair out. But Vucevic, by the numbers, is quietly having one of the better seasons in a contract year. Vuce is putting up 17.5 points per game on much better efficiency than last season. In fact, this is his best shooting season since his first time being an All-Star back in 2019. He's shooting 52% from the field on near 14 attempts per game, and while his three-point shooting isn't to the level it once was in his final years with the Magic, he's shooting much better than he was last season at 37% on 4.6 attempts per game. Compare that to last year when he was shooting 31% on the same volume. Vucevic is still rebounding the ball at an elite level, top 5 in the NBA at 11.1 rebounds per game, and he still remains one of the better big men passers in the league, tallying over 3 assists per game. In the month of January alone, Vucevic is averaging a little over 20 points per game, 13 rebounds, and 4.5 assists on 55, 37, 80 shooting splits. That's borderline an all-star level. And the other piece to note is that Vucevic is actually second on the team in box plus minus, only slightly behind DeRozan, also second in value over replacement player and win shares, and believe it or not, he actually leads the team in defensive win shares. The advanced metrics, on-court, off-court numbers, do not lie. In fact, if anything, they display that Vucevic is the Bulls' second best player behind DeRozan, not Zach Lavine. Now, we all know Zach had a slow start to the season with injuries, struggled with his shot, etc., but Vucevic really deserves more credit than Bulls fans give him. Not saying he's been dominant or that he still hasn't underperformed relative to the big haul we traded to get him, but he's playing better and providing a lot of impact on the court that often gets overlooked. Now, all that being said, what should the Bulls do with Vucevic? An expiring contract, obviously if they re-sign him, they maintain his bird rights, which presents advantages when it comes to using his salary to operate over the salary cap rather than signing a new free agent outright. But at the same time, does it make sense to re-sign a player who is 32, probably isn't ever going to be the all-star he once was as he continues to age, and even though Vucevic has declined, he's still good enough to warrant a fairly sizable payday, which impacts your books for the future considering you have Lavine locked up for the next 5 years, DeMar still on the books after this season, and of course Lonzo Ball for the next 3 seasons, 2 years after this season I should say, since he's likely not playing this year. Honestly, as I'm kind of thinking through this is what makes a GM's job so hard in the NBA because there are so many different scenarios you can go through even for just one player, and one decision can make or break your franchise and its future. But Here's the situation the Bulls have found themselves in right now, and what makes the Vucevic extension talk so challenging. And it's very similar to where they found themselves in with Zach Lavine in this past offseason when it came time for his extension. Because of the pivot the Bulls made in looking to win now, because of the focus on continuity, because of the fact that they had limited cap space to sign other free agents outright if they were to let one of their free agents go and their bird rights, they found themselves in a place where they almost had to sign said player because it actually would have been worse for the team if they let them walk for nothing. And let me explain. With Zach Lavine, yes, they could have offered him less money. Yes, they could have potentially done a sign and trade so they didn't lose him for nothing. But offering him slightly less than the max wouldn't have really done much in terms of their overall salary cap space, because they would have already been operating over the cap anyway. If they let Zach go because he was upset by a low offer and ended up signing with another team, it's not like they would have just been able to say, well, that's fine. Now we have all this cap space to sign other free agents. No, the fact remains, when you sign a free agent outright and you don't have their bird rights to be able to operate over the cap, at that point, you have to sign lesser players for less money and lose that extra money you would have otherwise been able to spend on a high-level player, in this instance like Zach Lavine. This is the same situation the Bulls find themselves in with Vucevic. Sure, they could just let him go, not re-sign him, treat those assets that they gave up for him as a sunk cost. But the amount of cap space they would free up by not re-signing Vucevic is actually very little, for the reasons I just explained about signing free agents outright rather than re-signing a player for which you own their bird rights. So it's really one of the two options. You make a trade before the deadline to try and recoup some of the value you lost. Maybe you get some players in return which you would now own their bird rights to, given you acquired them via a trade, which again allows you to operate over the cap. Or the other option is, and I'll be honest, I think it's the most plausible scenario, is you re-sign Vucevic on a short-term deal. I'm not saying that's the most ideal scenario, I'm not saying that that's the right scenario, but if I was a betting man, my guess is that's what the front office is going to do, because even though Vucevic has been playing well, he's been better than last season, his trade value isn't very high, partially because he's on an expiring contract, so any team that does make a trade for him will have to pay him, unless they're okay taking him on as a half-year rental and losing assets for him in return. And then the other piece, there are only so many teams who actually have the right salary options to be able to move players to match Vucevic's salary, and teams that would actually need a guy like Vucevic. When you're trading for a guy like Vuce, who is 32, young teams that are looking to build for the future aren't going to want him. He wouldn't fit their timeline. You're talking about a handful of teams that are looking to contend now and are in need of a big that can crash the boards and give you some scoring. Vuce's lack of defense and his age hurts his trade value, and because of that, knowing you're probably not going to get the kind of return you would want for Vuce in a trade, most teams aren't going to be willing to ship over draft picks and young players for Vuce. It makes moving him before the deadline very unlikely. Re-signing him, it has to be a short-term deal. Anything more than 2 years is a mistake in my opinion, unless you're able to get him on a very cheap 3-year deal, say in the range of 3 years, $40 to $45 million. You're talking between 14 to 15 million a year, which is pretty good value for someone like Vuce based on his production. But I highly doubt Vuce is going to want an offer that low. He still sees himself as a high-level player in this league and wants to be compensated as such. My guess is he's going to be looking for something in the range of 2 years, $40 million, $20 million a year, which I know for some might seem like an overpay, but when you factor in the NBA salary cap increase going into next season, the fact that when you compare it to some of his peers and the bags they were able to secure, it's not that bad of a contract. Sure, it would be better to get Vuce on something like 2 years, $35 million, but I find it hard to believe he'll take something that low. So with all that in mind, what do the Bulls do with Vucevic as we near the deadline? To be honest, I think it's going to make the most sense to just re-sign him unless you can get some crazy haul of a trade for him. Then obviously you move him, but I don't see that happening. Also keep in mind, just because they sign him to an extension doesn't mean they can't still trade him over the offseason or into next season. In fact, it gives them more options when it comes to maintaining a player's bird rights with whoever you get for in that trade. But that's just my view though. I want to know what you guys think the Bulls should do with Vucevic. Let me know in the comments, and as always, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.